The galaxy's gentle giants, the galactic Concord, had seen many species rise and join its ranks over the centuries. Some came with fire and conquest. Some came with trade and clever words. Some arrived already broken, looking for protection. But humans arrived with handshakes and food. That was the thing other species remembered most about the early days of human contact. The humans brought food, meals, and offered them to alien diplomats who had no idea what to make of the gesture. Some species found it confusing, few found it offensive, but most over time found it oddly charming. Humanity had made formal contact with the galactic Concord 83 years ago. In that time, they had done what most senior species expected of a young civilization. They stumbled, they learned, they apologized often, and they tried very hard to fit in. They were not the strongest species in the Concord. They were not the smartest. They did not have the oldest ships or the most advanced weapons. What they had was an unusual amount of patience and a deep, almost strange desire to get along with everyone. The older species found humans entertaining. The Falori, who had been in the Concord for over 4,000 years, viewed humans the way one might view a puppy, that kept tripping over its own feet. Endearing, harmless, a little loud sometimes. Chancellor Zealous of the Falori often made quiet jokes about human diplomats in private council sessions. He called them the weeping species, because of how often human representatives got emotionally involved in cases that did not even concern their own worlds. Once, a human ambassador had cried during a Concord, hearing about the displacement of a small insectoid colony on the far side of the galaxy. The colony was not human. The humans had no political interest in it whatsoever. The ambassador cried anyway. Chancellor Xylos had found this deeply amusing. He told the story at every diplomatic dinner for the next decade. But the thing that truly puzzled the rest of the galaxy, the thing that was discussed in academic papers and cultural studies across dozens of species, was how humans felt about their children. Every species had young. Every species protected its offspring to some degree. It was basic biology, but humans took it to a level that seemed almost irrational to outside observers. Human young were not productive. They could not work, could not fight, could not contribute to the economy or the military for many years after birth. And yet, humans treated them as though they were the most valuable things in the universe. There were entire human legal systems built around child protection. There were wars in human history. Brutal, devastating wars that had started because children were harmed. Human literature, music, art, and religion all circled back to the same theme again and again. The child is sacred. The child must be protected at all costs. The Vreth, cold and practical species, found this particularly ridiculous. The Vreth were insectoid, tall, gray, hard shells and compound eyes that saw the world in terms of efficiency and resource management. In Vreth society, young were simply the next generation of workers. They were fed, housed, and trained. They were not loved in any way the humans would recognize. The idea of going to war over a child was so foreign to Vreth, thinking that it did not even exist as a concept in their language. This would turn out to be a very costly gap in understanding. The trouble began, as so much trouble does, with a piece of land. Alara was a small agricultural world sitting near the edge of what the Galactic Concord called the Disputed Frontier, a stretch of space where old territorial maps conflicted with newer ones and where no one had ever bothered to draw very clean lines. The world itself was nothing remarkable. It had wide, flat plains, clean water, breathable air, and soil that crops beautifully. Humans had settled it 60 years ago. They had built towns, schools, hospitals, and farms. They had planted trees that were now tall enough to give shade. 12,000 people lived on Alara IV. Roughly 4,000 of them were children. Nobody in the Galactic Concord thought much about Alara IV. It was not a strategic world. It had no rare minerals. It had no military value. It was simply a quiet colony where people lived ordinary lives and sent grain shipments back to the more crowded human worlds. Then the Vreth Empire filed a territorial claim. The claim appeared on the Concord's administrative desk one Tuesday morning, or what passed for Tuesday on Nexus Prime, the great space station that served as the Concord's central hub. The Vreth argued, using documents that were technically accurate but selectively presented, that Alara IV fell within a zone of space that had historically been under Vreth influence before humans arrived. They were not asking for the humans to leave immediately. They were simply asking the Concord to recognize the territory as disputed and begin a Formal review process. It was, on the surface, a perfectly normal diplomatic move. Ambassador Dale Oren read the claim 3 times before he said anything. He was a tall man, gray at the temples, with a particular kind of tired calm that came from spending 30 years in galactic diplomacy. He had negotiated trade deals with species that communicated through color changes in their skin. He had once spent 6 months mediating a conflict between 2 civilizations that measured time in completely different units and could not agree on when anything had happened. He was not easily alarmed. But something about the Vreth claim made him uneasy in a way he could not quite explain. He requested a formal hearing before the Concord Council. He asked for the territorial documents to be reviewed by independent cartographers. He recommended that a Concord observation team be sent to Alara 4 to register the civilian presence before any administrative decisions were made. He was polite. He was thorough. He followed every rule. The council heard him. Chancellor Xylus nodded thoughtfully. The Vreth representative, thin official named Delegate Vostar, smiled in the way that Vreth smiled, which was mostly just a slight widening of the jaw that other species found unsettling. The council voted to begin a formal review. It would take approximately 4 months. Ambassador Oren went back to his office and sent a quiet message to the United Earth Fleet, flagging the situation as something to watch. He did not use urgent language. He did not request warships. He simply noted it. He was a diplomat. He believed in the process. He believed that people, most of the time, did not actually want to do terrible things. They just needed the right framework to stop them. He was right about most people. He was wrong about the Vreth. While the Concord's review process moved at its usual slow and careful pace, the Vreth were doing something else entirely. They were moving ships. Not many ships. Not enough to trigger any automatic alerts in the Concord's monitoring systems. Just a small fleet, quietly repositioned, sitting just outside the edge of Alara Ive's solar system, waiting. The Vreth High Command had looked at the numbers and made a calculation. Alara the Foy was remote. The nearest human military ships were 3 days away at standard speed. The Concord review would drag on for months. And the humans, the gentle, food-offering, crying at other people's problems humans, would not escalate. They never escalated. That was the human way. On Alara the Fort itself, life continued as it always had. Farmers woke early and checked their crops. Children walked to school along dusty roads. In the town of Mira's Landing, the biggest settlement on the planet, a woman named Governor Hannah Reeve was reviewing crop reports and arguing cheerfully with her agricultural secretary about water allocation. She had heard about the Vreth territorial claim. A Concord notice had come through her administrative system 3 weeks ago. She had read it, frowned, trusted that Ambassador Oren and the Concord would handle it, and gone back to her crop reports. Nobody on Alara the Fourth was frightened. Why would they be? They were citizens of a Concord member species. They had done nothing wrong. The system would protect them. That was the thing about humans that the Vreth had studied and had decided to use against them. Humans trusted the system. Humans believed in the process. Humans would wait and talk and file the right documents and wait some more. The Vreth fleet commander, War Master Sketh, reviewed his orders one final time. They were simple: move to Alara the Fourth, establish administrative presence, begin relocation procedures. The word relocation in the official orders was precise Vreth bureaucratic language. It meant something specific in Vreth protocol. Something that had never been fully translated into the Concord's common tongue, because the Concord had never asked. In the quiet of his command deck, with the lights of Alara the Fourth's sun just becoming visible on his forward screens, War Master Sketh gave the order to advance. 3 days away, in the engine room of the UEF warship Unyielding, Admiral Sarah Voss was drinking terrible coffee and reviewing crew rotation schedules. She had not yet received any alert. There was no alert to receive, not yet. On Alara 4th, in a schoolroom in Mira's Landing, 23 children were learning about the stars. Their teacher, a young man named Mr. Calder, had put a projection of the galaxy on the ceiling. The children lay on their backs and looked up at it, pointing at distant lights and asking questions he could not always answer. One girl asked which star was the farthest one they could see. Mr. Calder told her he wasn't sure, but that someday she might be the one to go and find out. She smiled at that. Outside the school, the sky was clear and golden and completely, perfectly quiet. What they did to Alara the Fourth. The Vreth ships came out of the dark without any warning. Signal. There were 9 of them, Gray, flat-bodied vessels that moved in a tight formation, their hulls designed to absorb sensor pings rather than reflect them. They entered Alara the Foy's orbit just before local dawn, when most of the colony was still asleep. By the time the planetary monitoring station picked up their arrival, the ships were already in position above every major settlement. Governor Hannah Reeve was woken by her emergency comm at 4 in the morning. She sat up in bed, answered it, and listened without speaking for almost a full minute. Then she got dressed very quickly and walked to the Situation Room, where her small staff of administrators and the colony's single security officer already gathered around a screen showing 9 blinking red dots in orbit. The Vreth broadcast came through on standard Concord communication frequency. It was polite in the way that a locked door is polite. Technically not violent, but entirely clear about the situation. War Master Sketh's voice was flat and unhurried. He identified himself. He stated that Alara IV was now under provisional Vreth administrative authority, pending the outcome of the Concord Territorial Review. He told the colonists they had 6 hours to gather personal belongings and proceed to the colony's main landing field, where Vreth transport vessels would collect them and move them to a neutral processing station. He told them that resistance would be inadvisable. He told them that the process would be orderly. Then the broadcast ended. Governor Reeve stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she did 3 things in quick order. She sent an emergency distress signal to Ambassador Oren at Nexus Prime. She sent an emergency request for military assistance to the nearest UEF patrol route. And then she got on the colony-wide broadcast and told her people what was happening. She told them to stay calm. She told them the Concorde would respond. She told them to bring their children indoors and wait. The colonists did what she said. 12,000 people moved toward the colony's large pressurized dome structures, the ones designed for severe weather events, and sealed themselves inside. Farmers left their fields. Shop owners locked their doors. Parents picked up their children from wherever they were and held them close. In the schoolroom where Mr. Calder had shown his students the stars the evening before, the children were now sitting in the hallway with their backs against the wall, some of them holding hands, one small boy very quietly crying into the sleeve of his jacket because he did not understand what was happening, but he could feel that the adults around him were frightened. War Master Sketh waited 4 hours. Then he sent a second broadcast. The colonists had not moved to the landing field. They were, from a Vreth perspective, being uncooperative. Sketh consulted his orders. His orders gave him authority to use standard crowd management procedures in the event of non-compliance. He authorized the use of Vreth atmospheric dispersal canisters, a tool his fleet carried as a matter of routine. The canisters were not designed to kill. In Vreth biology, the chemical compound they released caused temporary respiratory distress, disorientation, and compliance. It had been used hundreds of times in Vreth administrative operations on Vreth worlds with Vreth populations. The dosage had been calibrated very carefully for Vreth physiology. Nobody in the Vreth fleet had run the numbers on human children. The canisters were deployed from low-altitude drones at 7:13 in the morning, local time. The compound entered the ventilation systems of the dome structures within minutes. The adult colonists began coughing, feeling dizzy, struggling to breathe but mostly staying conscious. Most of them would recover. The children began dying within the first 20 minutes. Human children had smaller lung capacity, faster respiratory rates, and immune systems that reacted to the compound in a way that was catastrophically different from the adult response. Their small bodies went into shock faster than any adult could understand what was happening. Parents held their children and screamed. People pounded on dome walls. The colony's 2 doctors ran from child to child doing everything they knew how to do, which was not enough, because there was nothing to be done without the right treatment, and there was no right treatment available on Alara. Governor Reeve managed to open a broadcast channel in the chaos. She pointed a comm device at what was happening around her and she sent it, not just to the Concorde, not just to Ambassador Oren, but on every open frequency she could reach. Raw, unedited, the screaming, children on the floor, the parents on their knees. The signal traveled at the speed of light and faster, bouncing off relay stations across the sector. It reached Nexus Prime in 41 minutes. Ambassador Oren was in the middle of a breakfast meeting with a trade delegation from the Suri Collective when his personal comm lit up with an Emergency override. He picked it up. He listened for 6 seconds. Then he stood up from the table without saying a word, walked out of the room, into a run in the corridor outside. Something no one in 30 years of diplomatic service had ever seen Dale Oren do. The signal reached the Galactic Concorde's main broadcast network 2 minutes later, because a young communications officer on Nexus Prime made a decision that was technically against protocol, but that she would never regret. She put it on the public channel. Every screen in every Concorde member's embassy, every news feed, every public terminal in the Concorde's network showed what was happening on Alara 4th. The galaxy went very quiet. Species that had been arguing about trade tariffs stopped arguing. Council members who had been in the middle of long, complicated speeches stopped speaking. In cafeterias and waiting rooms and offices across dozens of worlds, people stared at screens and watched human children dying on a small agricultural planet that most of them had never heard of. Some species wept. Some expressed formal condolences through diplomatic channels within the hour. The Suri Collective immediately called for an emergency Concorde session. 3 smaller member species filed joint statements of condemnation against the Vreth before the day was out. Chancellor Xylos of the Filori watched the broadcast in his private office. He sat very still for a long time afterward. Then he called for an emergency council session and began drafting language for formal sanctions. He believed this was the correct response. He believed the Concorde would investigate, condemn, sanction, and eventually bring the Vreth to account through the proper channels. It would take time, but the system would work. He sent a message to Ambassador Oren expressing the Concorde's deepest condolences and assuring him that justice would be pursued through every available diplomatic mechanism. Oren did not reply. By the time the emergency signal reached the UEF unyielding, the numbers were already coming in. The colony's medical system had been running automated counts. 2,241 children had died in the first 2 hours. Hundreds more were critical. The compound was still in the air. Admiral Sarah Voss read the report standing at her command station. She read it once. Then she read it again, not because she had not understood it the first time, because some part of her needed a second moment before she decided what happened next. Her bridge crew was silent. They had all seen the broadcast. A young ensign at the navigation console had been crying quietly for the past 20 minutes and had not tried to hide it. Nobody had said anything to her about it. Nobody would. Voss set the report down on her console. She looked at her crew. She looked at the star map on the forward screen, which showed Alara Phi as a small green dot and showed the Vreth ships in orbit around it as 9 red ones. Then she looked at the course that would take her ship to Alara IV in the fastest time possible, and she looked at the broader chart that showed where Vreth space was, and she looked at both of those things for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely calm. Not the calm of someone who was not feeling anything. Calm of someone who had felt everything already and had come out the other side of it into a place that was very cold and very clear. She said 4 words. All stop. Battle stations. The unyielding came out of travel speed so smoothly that it barely shuddered. Every light on the ship shifted from white to red. Every crew member moved to their assigned post. Systems that had been in standby for weeks came online one by one. The young ensign at the navigation console wiped her face with the back of her hand and pulled up the tactical screen. Nobody asked the admiral what they were doing. They already knew. And not one of them, not one, had any objection. 3 days away in the Concord Council chamber, Chancellor Xylos was preparing to call the emergency session to order. He was thinking about sanctions language and diplomatic pressure, and the formal complaint process. He had not yet understood that the moment for all of that had already passed. On Alara IV, the gas was slowly thinning. The surviving colonists moved through the domes in a daze, finding each other, counting who was missing, sitting on the floor next to small still forms, and making sounds that had no words in any language. The sky above the dome was blue and quiet and full of Vreth ships. But somewhere in that same sky, much farther away, something was moving toward them. Something that had heard the screaming and had made a decision. And it was not coming to file a complaint. The wrath, beneath the warmth, the rest of the galaxy expected humans to be loud about it. That was the assumption, based on everything the other species knew about humanity. Humans were emotional. Humans were expressive. When they were hurt, they talked about it. When they were angry, They made speeches. The Galactic Concord braced for protests, for impassioned addresses to the Council, weeping diplomats demanding justice in front of every camera they could find. What happened instead was silence. Within 6 hours of the Alara 4 broadcast reaching the wider Concord network, every human diplomat in alien space began quietly packing. There were no announcements. There were no farewell messages. Human embassies on 17 different worlds simply went dark, lights off, locked, staff gone, not expelled, not evacuating in panic, simply and calmly leaving, as if someone had sent a message that said, "Come home now," and every human in the galaxy had received it at the same moment and obeyed without question. Chancellor Xylas noticed the embassy on Nexus Prime going quiet at around midday. He sent a message to the human consulate, no reply. He sent another to Ambassador Oren personally, no reply. He walked down to the human section of the diplomatic quarter himself and found the doors sealed and the lights off, and a small automated notice on the door that said, in perfectly polite Concord standard language, "This office is temporarily closed. Thank you for your understanding." He stood in front of that door for a long time. For the first time in many years, Chancellor Xylas felt something he had not expected to feel. Afraid. Not of anything he could point to. Not of a specific threat. Just afraid, the way you feel when the weather changes very fast and you realize you do not have shelter. Back on Earth, things were moving. The Global Senate of the United Earth Federation had convened within 3 hours of the Alara Afif footage reaching the home planet. The session was closed. No cameras, no public broadcast. The full chamber of 240 representatives met in complete privacy, which was itself unusual. Human governance tended toward public debate, open sessions, transparent process. The fact that they had closed the doors told anyone paying attention that whatever was happening in that room was not something they wanted on record, yet. The session lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. When the doors opened, the representatives filed out quietly. Most of them looked the same way that Voss had looked on her bridge, not broken, not panicked, but settled. As if something had been decided so completely that there was nothing left to argue about. The resolution that had passed was not made public for another 12 hours. When it finally was released, it was a single paragraph. No diplomatic language, no caveats, no conditional clauses. It stated that the Vreth Empire had committed an act of mass killing against human civilians, including human children, that this act was deliberate in its execution regardless of stated intent, and that the United Earth Federation held the Vreth Empire fully and without exception responsible. The final sentence read, "The Vreth Empire shall be made to answer for this completely, and the United Earth Federation will determine the form of that answer without outside guidance, no declaration of war, no list of demands, no ultimatum, just that." The Vreth government received a copy through standard channels. Delegate Vostar, who had smiled his unsettling Vreth smile in the Concord Council chamber just days ago, read the resolution 3 times and then called an emergency session of the Vreth High Command. They were not worried. The humans had no history of rapid military deployment. Their fleet was spread thin across their colonial territories. The Vreth had run the numbers many times. Even if every human warship mobilized at once, the Vreth could match them in raw numbers. And the humans, the reasoning went, would not actually go that far. They would threaten, they might skirmish, but full war, against a species that had been in the Concord for centuries longer than them? With allies and diplomatic weight and established supply lines? No, the humans would negotiate. They always negotiated. What the Vreth Intelligence Service did not know, what they could not have known, because humanity had been very careful, was that the fleet they were counting against did not represent what humans actually had. Over the 80 years since joining the Concord, humanity had done what young civilizations always do when they are surrounded by larger, older, stronger neighbors. They had smiled, they had cooked food and offered it to people. They had cried at other people's problems in council chambers and made friends and built goodwill. And they had quietly, patiently, without ever drawing attention to it, built ships. Not just patrol vessels. Not just the diplomatic escorts and border guards they reported to the Concord's fleet registry. Real warships. Designed in secret research stations, built in facilities on the dark side of moons. Crewed by people who had trained for years for a scenario that most of them privately hoped would never come. 212 of those ships began moving within 18 hours of the global Senate session ending. They came from everywhere, from hidden docks behind gas giants, from deep space stations that did not appear on any Concorde map, from long patrol routes where they had been hiding in plain sight as freighters and research vessels. They moved in total communications silence, using a navigation protocol that human engineers had developed specifically because standard Concorde tracking systems could not read it. On Nexus Prime, the Concorde's fleet monitoring system showed almost nothing unusual. A few human patrol ships repositioning. Routine movement. In reality, the largest human military force ever assembled was converging on Vreth space with the quiet focus of something that had been waiting a very long time. In the Vreth Intelligence Division, a young analyst named Kreth 7 was doing what Vreth analysts always did when a situation became uncertain, going back to the data. She pulled every piece of recorded human cultural information the Empire had on file: history, literature, religious texts, music, films, stories told to children. She was looking for a pattern, something that would help predict what the humans would actually do, not what the High Command assumed they would do. She found the pattern inside 4 hours. It was everywhere, in every human story, every myth, every religious tradition, every piece of cultural output going back thousands of years. There was one constant thread that appeared again and again, without exception, across every culture, every continent, every era of human history. It was so common that human scholars barely even noticed it anymore. It was simply the background of everything. You do not harm the children, not as a law, not as a rule. Something deeper than that. Something that sat below all the politics and all the diplomacy and all the patient smiling and the cooking of food and the crying in council chambers. Something that was not a choice but a nature. Kreth 7 wrote her report in 2 hours. She classified it at the highest level and sent it directly to the High Command. The subject line read, "Extinction level behavioral trigger, confirmed." The report itself was thorough and careful and explained in precise language exactly what the Vreth had done by deploying that gas on Alara Afoiv, and exactly what that meant for what would happen next. The High Command received the report. They read it. They discussed it. Then they sent Sev a response telling her that her analysis was emotional and not supported by strategic logic, and that the situation was under control. Kreth 7 read the response. She saved her report to a personal archive. Then she went, very quietly, to the Vreth Civilian Administration building and requested emergency reassignment to a non-military post in the farthest of Vreth space that she could reach. She did not explain why. She did not have to. War Master Sketh, still orbiting Alara IV with his 9 ships, received a message from the High Command telling him that the situation was being managed diplomatically and that he should hold his position. He was also told that if any human military vessels approached, he had authorization to warn them away. The Concorde's rules of engagement were clear. Military action in disputed territory during an active review process required Concorde authorization. Sketh sent back a confirmation and settled in to wait. He was not afraid. He had run every calculation. He knew where the nearest human ships were. He knew how long it would take them to arrive. He knew the Concorde would step in before anything serious happened. He did not know about the 212 ships. Ambassador Orin sent one final message to the Concorde before his personal comm went offline. It was addressed to the full council, not to Xillis alone. It was short. He had written and deleted longer versions several times before settling on these few lines. He wrote, "You asked us, many times over the years, whether we had the spine for real galactic politics. You found us soft. You found us sentimental. You thought our feelings were a weakness. I want you to understand something before what comes next. Our feelings were never the thing you should have been watching. You should have been watching what we do when our feelings reach the end of their patience. We remember every child's name from Alara IV, all 2,241 of them. We will still remember them when this is over. Goodbye for now." The message went out. The comm went offline. On the bridge of the Unyielding, Admiral Voss was looking at a tactical display that now showed her the full picture. Her ship, the ships converging from across human space, and Vreth Prime sitting on the other side of that vast dark distance. She was not thinking about victory. She was not thinking about what the Concorde would say or what history would record. She was thinking about 23 children in a schoolroom learning about the stars. She was thinking about a girl who wanted to go see the farthest one. She pulled up her navigation chart and marked a course. The unyielding began to move. Behind it, in the dark, 211 other ships turned and followed, silent as a held breath. A reckoning that the Vreth Empire had earned with a decision made at 7:13 in the morning, on a small quiet world that had done nothing wrong at all. Farewell, the Vreth High Command received its first real warning 37 hours after the global Senate session on Earth. It did not come from their intelligence service. It did not come through Concord channels. It came because a Vreth cargo freighter on a routine route happened to be in the right part of space at the wrong moment and saw something on its long-range sensors that should not have been there. The freighter captain sent a burst transmission to the nearest Vreth military relay station. The message was 4 words long. They are already here. The relay station forwarded it up the chain of command. By the time it reached the high command, 11 minutes had passed. In those 11 minutes, the human fleet had already crossed the outer marker of what the Vreth considered their defensive perimeter, a boundary marked by sensor buoys and early warning stations that were supposed to give the Vreth fleet hours of preparation time. The buoys had detected nothing. The stations had registered nothing. The human ships had passed through the perimeter like light through glass, and the Vreth were only finding out because of a cargo freighter captain who happened to be looking in the right direction. The high command scrambled. Orders went out to the Vreth fleet, a substantial force, well-armed, experienced in the kind of territorial conflicts that the Vreth had been involved in across their long history. They moved to intercept. They took up defensive positions around Vreth Prime and the 3 colony worlds that formed the core of the Empire. They activated weapons platforms and charged their defensive shields and did everything that centuries of military experience told them to do. They were ready for a battle. What arrived was something else. The human fleet came out of its silent approach formation, at a distance that was just outside maximum Vreth weapons range. They did not charge forward. They did not open fire. They stopped. They sat there, 212 ships, in a formation that Vreth military analysts stared at for several minutes before any of them could say what it was a net. Every X-vector from the Vreth home system, every possible route a ship could take to escape, to resupply, to call for help, was covered. Not jammed, not blocked by physical obstacles, simply covered. A human ship was positioned on every one of them, at exactly the right distance and the right angle. The mathematics of it were precise in a way that made the Vreth fleet commander's chief tactician quietly ask his subordinates to double-check the numbers because he did not want to believe what he was seeing. The numbers were right. The humans had mapped every exit vector before they arrived and had placed their ships accordingly. They had not just come to fight. They had come to make sure there was no leaving. Admiral Voss opened a communication channel to the Vreth fleet. Her voice was clear and even. She said, "In Cis Admiral Sir Voss of the United Earth Federation, we are not here to negotiate. We are not here to receive a surrender yet. We are here to end the Vreth Empire's ability to do what it did at Alara IV ever again. You will see us work. When we are finished, we will talk about what comes after." The channel closed. The Vreth fleet commander sent a response, a warning, demands, a threat, the standard language of military confrontation. It was received by an automated human system. The automated system sent back a standard acknowledgement signal, which was perhaps the most insulting possible response. Then the human ships began to move. Not toward the Vreth fleet, not directly. The first targets were the Vreth military shipyards. The great orbital construction platforms where Vreth warships were built and repaired. They were heavily defended, surrounded by weapons platforms and escort vessels. Military strategists across the Concord, who were now watching this on long-range sensors from a very safe distance, expected the humans to grind through those defenses over many hours at great cost. The attack lasted 40 minutes. Every Vreth shipyard in the home system was disabled, not destroyed, disabled. Weapons offline, engines cold, docking clamps locked open. The human strike teams hit them simultaneously from multiple angles, using attack patterns that the Vreth defensive systems had clearly never encountered. The defending platforms fired a great deal. They hit very little. The human ships moved like they had studied every Vreth weapons system in detail, which, the Concord analysts slowly realized, they probably had. The Vreth fleet moved to engage. while the shipyard attack was still happening. They launched everything, a massive force that outnumbered the attacking human ships considerably. They were larger. They were individually more powerful. Several of the Vreth capital ships had weapons that could hit at ranges the human fleet should not have been able to counter, should not have been. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted 9 hours. In those 9 hours, the Vreth fleet lost 61% of its combat vessels and 100% of its long-range weapons capability. Human losses were 11 ships, 3 destroyed, 8 damaged enough to pull back from active combat. The Vreth fought hard and they fought well, and it made almost no difference at all. Concord analysts watching from a distance could not fully explain what they were seeing. The human ships seemed to know what the Vreth ships were going to do before they did it. Strike patterns shifted in real time. When the Vreth tried to concentrate their fire on a single human target, the formation around that target adjusted before the weapons could land. When the Vreth opened a flanking corridor to pull human ships out of position, a human unit was already moving to close it. One analyst, an elderly Falori woman who had studied military history for 60 years, put her data tablet down partway through the 6th hour and said, very quietly, to no one in particular, they have been preparing for this for a long time. She was right. The tactics the human fleet was using had not been developed for this specific battle. They were the product of decades of quiet, careful preparation, war games run in classified facilities, strategies developed for scenarios that human military planners had hoped would never happen but had planned for anyway, because that was what humans did. They prepared for the worst while hoping for the best, and they never, ever showed anyone the full extent of what they had prepared. In the middle of the 9th hour, with the Vreth fleet broken and falling back, Admiral Voss opened a channel again. This time it went directly to the Vreth military command. She said, I know you have young. My people know where your nurseries and schools are. We have known since we entered this system. We have not touched them. We will not touch them. That is the difference between your high command and us. Remember it. Remember it in whatever time you have left to think about it. She closed the channel. In the Vreth Command Center, a senior general played that message back 3 times. He was not a person who felt things easily. Vreth biology did not really work that way. Something in those words settled into him like cold water and stayed there. The third target set was the Vreth Silitary Communication Network, the relay stations and command hubs that allowed the High Command to coordinate forces across the Empire. These went down between hours 7 and 9, taken offline one by one with a precision that left civilian communications completely untouched. When the last relay went dark, the Vreth Empire's military could no longer talk to itself across any distance greater than a single star system. It was, for a military force, like going suddenly blind and deaf at the same time. The Vreth High Command had been trying to reach their system forces for 2 hours when they finally understood that there were no outer system forces left to reach. They had been neutralized already, not by the main fleet, by a secondary human force that had split off before the main engagement began and had simply worked through the outer military installations, quietly while everyone was watching the battle at Vreth Prime. At hour 9, the Vreth fleet commander, the last senior military officer still in a position to give orders, made a decision. He sent a message to Admiral Voss through military channels, which no longer worked but through a civilian communication relay. The message said, "What do you want?" Voss replied within 30 seconds. She said, "The same thing we wanted before you killed our children. We want you to be held responsible." That option looked different then than it does now. There was a long pause. Then the Vreth commander sent 3 more words. "What are your terms?" Voss looked at her senior staff. They looked back at her. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then she began to dictate. The Vreth High Command. Every member who had given or approved the order at Alara IV would surrender themselves for trial. The Vreth military would stand down completely. All weapons platforms in the home system would go offline and remain offline pending Concord oversight. The transport ships that had carried the colonists from Ithra IV would return them immediately to human space with full medical support. And then, the last term which she had saved for last deliberately, because she knew it would be the one that no one expected. Every Vreth civilian and non-military population would be protected. Every Vreth young, every civilian settlement, every ordinary person who had lived their life and followed orders and not made the decision at Elara IV, they would be completely untouched. Trial would be for those who chose, not for those who happened to be born Vreth. The Concorde, watching all of this on long-range feeds, had been in an uproar for hours. Emergency sessions, urgent messages to human diplomatic channels that were not being answered, appeals to galactic law and proper process and jurisdictional authority. War Master Sketh, still at Elara IV with his 9 ships, received no more orders from the High Command, because the High Command could no longer send any. His ship's weapons were still active. He still had the authority, technically, to do something terrible. He sat on his command deck for a long time. He looked at the planet below him, the farms, the roads, the towns, and he thought about the calculation he had made 72 hours ago when he had decided that the humans would not escalate. Then he powered down his weapon systems and sent a short message on open frequency. I am standing down. I am requesting transport to stand trial. The 9 Vreth ships in orbit around Elara IV went dark and still, hanging in the sky above the colony dome like gray stones. Below them, inside the dome, a woman sat on the floor next to a small covered form and did not look up at the sky at all. She was not thinking about what had happened in Vreth space. She was not thinking about justice or terms or trial. She was thinking about her daughter, who had asked that morning, just the morning before, which felt like 100 years ago, whether she could have her hair braided for school. She had said maybe later. Later had not come. Outside the dome, the sky was still blue. The crops in the untended fields were still standing tall. The wind moved through them in long, slow waves, back and forth, the way it always had, as if nothing had changed at all. Everything had changed. What the galaxy learned 6 months after the fall of Vreth Prime, the galaxy was quieter than it had been in a long time. Not peaceful, not exactly. Quiet in the way a room goes quiet after something heavy has been set down on the table. Everyone looking at it, everyone aware of its weight, nobody quite ready to speak first. The trials were held on a neutral station in the Concorde Central Zone, a courtroom that had been used for serious cases before, but never for something quite like this. War Master Sketh sat in the front row on the first day, in Vreth restraints that were designed for his biology, and he looked straight ahead, with the flat compound eyes of his species, and showed nothing. Beside him and behind him sat the senior officers who had approved the deployment at Elara IV, and, behind them, sat the 3 members of the Vreth High Command, who had signed the original administrative order that sent Sketh's fleet to the colony in the first place. Delegate Vostar was not there. He had died in the evacuation of Vreth Prime's command center, not at human hands, in the panic of a corridor collapse, during the power disruptions that followed the battle. The Concorde recorded his death as accidental. Whether it was or not, no one could say with certainty. The human judges who presided over the trials were not famous people. They were not the most senior lawyers in the Federation, or the most politically important figures. They were just careful, experienced, thorough people who believed that the purpose of a trial was to establish what had happened and why, and to make clear that there would be a consequence. They did their work without drama and without speeches. They took testimony. They reviewed records. They asked questions. The trials lasted 11 weeks. The verdicts were not surprising. Every senior officer who had deployed the gas or approved its deployment was found responsible. The High Command members who had ordered the administrative action that put civilians in that situation without adequate protection or planning were found responsible at a higher level. The sentences varied by degree of involvement, but all of them were serious, and all of them were carried out. War Master Sketh, who had given the direct order, received the most severe judgment. He showed no reaction when it was read. He had not shown any reaction at any point in the trial. Whether that was pride or shock or simply the way Vreth faces worked, no one could tell. The Vreth Empire, as a political structure, ceased to exist at the conclusion of the trials. Its remaining worlds were placed under Concorde Provisional Administration, a process that was expected to last at least 20 years before anything resembling self-governance could be restored. Civilian populations were not displaced, not imprisoned, not punished. Ordinary life on Vreth worlds continued. Schools stayed open. Food supply chains were maintained. The distinction between the people who had decided and the people who had simply lived was honored, completely, without exception. This was noticed not loudly, not in any official way, but across the galaxy. diplomatic offices and military commands and government chambers. Certain people looked at what humanity had done and then sat quietly with it for a while. They had expected revenge. Every piece of behavioral modeling that non-human analysts had done on the human response predicted something. Blunt and total, emotion driving action, anger producing destruction beyond what was strictly necessary. It was what the older species always assumed about younger ones, and especially about humans, who wore their feelings so visibly. Instead, what they got was precision, accountability that fell exactly where it was supposed to fall. An enemy's military dismantled completely, and their civilians protected completely at the same time. And underneath all of it, that cold and certain quality that was not anger exactly, or not only anger, but something more like a promise kept. The Concord held a formal session 6 weeks after the trial concluded to discuss the status of humanity's role in the Concord going forward. Several species had filed requests for clarification on various points: human military capacity, the ships that had never been disclosed, covert preparation that had clearly been going on for decades. There were concerns. There were accusations of bad faith from members who felt that a Concord nation maintaining a secret fleet was a violation of certain understood. Ambassador Dale Oren was back. He had come out of his self-imposed silence when the trials began, and he had come back looking the same as always. A little tired, a little gray, wearing the same kind of plain suit he always wore. He sat in the human representative seat and listened to all of it, and when it was his turn to speak, he spoke for 4 minutes. He said that humanity had never claimed to have no military. He said that the Concord Charter did not require full military disclosure, only non-aggression. He said that a family that locks its doors at night is not being dishonest with its neighbors about the existence of locks. Then he said something that no one in the room expected. He said he was sorry, not for what humanity had done to the Vreth military, not for the trials, not for the outcome. He was sorry, he said, for the years in which the distance between what humanity showed the galaxy and what humanity actually was had grown so wide. He said that the gap had been intentional, built from the reasonable fear of a young species in a galaxy, full of older ones, but that it had been dishonest, and that dishonesty had costs, and that some of those costs had been paid at Alara a fourth. If other species had known what humanity was truly capable of, he said, the calculation might have been different. Vreth might have made different choices, and children might still be alive. The chamber was quiet for a long time after that. And then he said the final thing, and he said it without drama, just evenly, the way you say something true that you've known for a long time. He said, we did not want to be feared. We still don't. We want to be good neighbors. We will shovel your path when it's difficult for you to walk. We will sit with you when you're suffering. We will bring you food that you probably won't know what to do with. That is still the offer, and it will always be the offer, for any species wise enough to understand what it means to us. But you should also understand, now, what neighbor means to us. It means we will do anything, to protect the people on our street, including the small ones, especially the small ones. He sat down. Chancellor Xylos, who had been making quiet jokes about human diplomats for a decade, did not make any jokes. He sat in his chair and looked at his hands and thought about a woman crying at a Concord hearing over an insectoid colony she had no connection to. And he thought about what that woman's people had just done. And he slowly began to understand that those two things were not contradictions. They were the same thing. In the weeks and months that followed, things changed in ways that were hard to track in any official record. Territorial claim near a human colony world that had been in slow review for 3 years was suddenly and quietly dropped by the species that filed. No explanation was given. A trade agreement that had been stalling was resolved quickly in humanity's favor. A diplomatic request that had been sitting in administrative limbo for months was approved within days. None of these things were officially connected to Alara IV. No one said out loud that they were afraid. Certain calculations had clearly changed in certain places, because certain things that people had not known before were now known. Several species began reforms, not loudly, not as public announcements, quietly. Old laws about the treatment of their own young were reviewed and in some cases strengthened. Policies that had treated children as low-priority resources were re-examined. Academic papers were written, many of them, about the relationship between how a species treats its young and what that species is willing to The paper's human history. The paper cited Alara Aforth, one paper, written by a Filori researcher, and published in the Concord's main academic journal, had a title that was discussed in 100 different languages, on 100 different worlds for years afterward. Humanity Protects tells us what humanity is. The researcher had written it as an academic study. It was read as a warning. It was also read as a kind of strange, quiet admiration. Alara IV was rebuilt over the following year. New dome structures, new school buildings, new farms planted with the same crops that had been seen in the fields on the morning everything changed. The surviving colonists were given the choice to leave or stay, with full support either way. Most of them stayed. Few left and did not come back, and nobody blamed them. The memorial was the last thing built. It was a single pillar of dark stone, placed in the center of Mira's Landing, in a small open square that the colony planners had cleared specifically for it. The stone was local, pulled from a quarry 10 kilometers outside town, cut smooth and polished until it caught the light. On its surface, carved by hand at the family's request, were the names of 2,241 children, every name, in order of age, oldest to youngest. The youngest was 7 months old. Admiral Sarah Voss came to Alara IV on a clear morning in early spring, 3 months after the memorial was completed. She came alone, without staff, without ceremony, without cameras. She wore her uniform because it was what she had. But she had left the rank insignia off. She was not there as an admiral. She stood in front of the pillar for a long time. The wind moved through the crops in the fields beyond the town's edge, that same long, slow wave it had always made. Birds that the colonists had brought from Earth generations ago called to each other in the trees that had grown tall enough to give shade. After a while, Voss became aware that she was not alone. She had not heard anyone arrive. She turned and saw that the small square was full of people. Colonists, workers, farmers, children who had survived. They had come quietly, the way her fleet had moved, without announcement. Just because they knew she was there and they had wanted to come. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say that was better than the silence. Voss turned back to the pillar. She reached out and rested her hand against the stone, flat-palmed for a moment. Then she lowered her hand and stepped back, and in the corner of the square, the path from the main road met the open ground. There were flowers. Dozens of them, laid in careful arrangements on the stone paving, brought by alien diplomatic envoys from 41 different Concord member species, none of whom had been asked to come. All of whom had come anyway. Some of the flowers were not native to any human world. Some of them were types that no human botanist had ever categorized. They had been brought across distances that took days or weeks to travel, by beings who looked nothing like the humans standing in that square. All of them had come because they understood, now, what had happened here. And all of them had come because they understood, now, what kind of people these were. The morning light fell across the names on the pillar, making each carved letter cast a small shadow, so that in the right light, at the right angle, every name seemed to stand out from the stone. Present, solid, still here. The wind blew, the crops moved, the children were still remembered. They always would be.